Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. It's fab to see so many people here already, and I'm sure a few more people will join us as we go along. Welcome to this webinar from Climate Outreach. My name is Dave, and I'm the lead of the Climate Engagement Lab here at Climate Outreach. I'll explain a little bit more about that in a second. Before we get started today, just a few bits of housekeeping. Firstly, questions. So we're going to be hearing from different speakers. If you have any questions at all about what you hear, put them in the dedicated Q&A question and answer box on your screen, not in the chat box. So if this is questions for the panelists, other people will see those questions and they have the opportunity to upvote them. And we'll have time for about 15 or 20 minutes of questions at the end, and I'll pick out the best ones. Also, our panelists will try to answer questions in line if they can. Use the chat box, as some people are doing now, if you want to introduce yourself, or for general comments for people that aren't panelists. Second, when you leave this call at the end of the session, you'll see a link to a survey. Please take a minute to fill this out. It's so important that we hear from you what you liked about today's session, what you didn't like, so we can continually improve for the future. We're going to record today's session for people that can't make it, but the only videos that anyone else will see will be the panelists, so you don't need to worry about that from your own point of view. And please do tweet about today's event and our research that we're going to be talking about today. That's the hashtag Britain Talks COP26, which you can see on your screen there. So my colleague Amira will say a few words in a minute to introduce us here at Climate Outreach and the work that we do, and why we think today's topic, COP26, and how to engage different audiences around it is so important. But first, I just wanted to say a couple of words about the new Climate Engagement Lab from Climate Outreach. Next slide, please, Siri. So the Climate Engagement Lab is a new unit from Climate Outreach, which supports UK civil society organisations to meaningfully engage the UK public, particularly those audiences that haven't typically been reached as much by campaigns over the years. And it prioritises working with organisations that have significant focuses on engaging the public, that are trying to reach new audiences that are underserved by UK campaigns, and who want to inspire more people to turn climate concern into meaningful action. You can see a link there, so climateoutreach.org/climate-engagement-lab if you want to find out more about what we're doing. The Climate Engagement Lab, sorry Siri, have the next slide please. The Climate Engagement Lab does three things in the main. It gives advice on engagement to campaigns and movements, helping to seed new engagement ideas and to test what works. It brings campaigners, strategists and funders together to understand who is reaching which audiences and to build shared strategies. And it delivers briefings, webinars and reports like today's sessions to help advocates and campaigners apply the evidence on social science to the most important real world issues. So today we're going to talk about Climate Outreach's Britain Talks COP26 research project. That's investigated how different segments of the UK public feel about the impending COP26 talks and how best to engage them around it. So you're going to hear from, in order, Amira Salas. I'll introduce Amira in a second. After Amira, you'll hear from Ben Margolis, who's the director of the Climate Coalition. Ben will say a few words about campaigning engagement around COP26. Then you'll hear from Susie Wang, senior researcher here at Climate Outreach, who'll run through the research that we've done and what it found. And then Webster, who's senior program lead for advocacy communications at Climate Outreach, will talk through some of the main implications of the research for campaigns and advocacy. Then there'll be time for question and answers. A reminder, there's a Q&A box on your screen. That's where to put questions for the panelists. Everything else, general thoughts and reactions, put in chat, including introducing yourself, as loads of people are doing now. But first, I'm just going to hand over to Amira Salas. Amira is the Programs and Research Director here at Climate Outreach, and she's just going to set the scene for us before we get into the research.
Thanks, Dave. So to start with, I'll say a word on who we are. Climate Outreach is an organisation that works to build a social mandate on climate change through evidence-based research and tools that can effectively engage people on climate change and climate action. I thought it would be useful to take a minute to sort of set the scene for this piece of work and why we think it's important and how we hope it helps you. So with 1 month to go until the crucial climate talks begin at COP26, we feel it is more important than ever to bring publics all over the world on board. While systemic government and business action is absolutely critical to meeting the 1.5 degree target and to supporting countries and communities to adapt and build resilience, It's clear that we're not going to achieve the rapid societal changes needed without the consent and participation of the majority of society. Acceptance of climate change policies and transformation of lifestyles simply won't happen without the buy-in of citizens. It's on all of us to put people at the heart of climate action. Just to say a few words about what climate outreach is doing at COP regarding the negotiations themselves. So there is actually a work programme emerging from Article 12 of the Paris Agreement called ACE, or Action for Climate Empowerment. And this calls on governments to implement 6 areas of work. So climate change education, training, public awareness, public participation, public access to information, and international cooperation along these themes. However, despite these being absolutely critical to catalysing our global transition, ACE has not been a priority for the majority of states. We're working with governments and civil society around COP to make this more of a priority, especially as the work programme is actually being updated this year. It's so important that this year does not slip by with a negotiated outcome that does not motivate and hold governments to account on ACE. So please do get in touch with us if you agree that this is important and you want to ensure that due attention is given to articulating a meaningful work programme at COP26. We'll also have a website very soon, and we hope that you'll attend and let us know how it goes. But coming back to our roles in putting people at the heart of climate action, at Climate Outreach, we always start from a position of listening and understanding where people are. So this research process that you're going to learn about today told us that people from all corners of society are worried about climate change and feel that acting on it can help bring us closer together. They feel that global unity is needed to address climate change, which makes COP26 an even more opportune moment to bring people together, to bring them with us and build a public mandate for climate action. But this requires us communicating with them through narratives and messages that they can relate to and that motivate and inspire them. So this report and webinar will give some really interesting insights into how the British public can be better engaged around COP26. I know we're just a month away, and it really feels like tomorrow for most of us, but there's still time to ensure that our messaging can be as powerful as possible. And so with that, I hope you enjoy the webinar today, and I hand back to Dave. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Amira. Without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Ben Margolis, who's very kindly joining us from the Climate Coalition. And Ben's just going to say a few words about the importance of reaching broader audiences at this critical moment. Over to you, Ben.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Dave and Amira, and for organising this. It's great to see there's so many people here because this is such a critical topic. And as Amira says, with a month to go until 26, but also vital going. I'll be brief, and I'm really sorry that I have to drop off as soon as I've said my words for another meeting. But I was just reflecting, I was thinking about this call today. I've been campaigning on climate change for 20 years, different ways, and how much things have changed in that time. So one of my first jobs related to climate change was when I was MGB, and was asked to write a briefing note for staff, an internal briefing note about why an organisation focused on poverty and inequality should also take into account climate change and try and encourage its supporters to be educated, become active in climate change. And at the time that wasn't obvious, and that has obviously changed massively. And in fact, the call I have to go back to now is a meeting of chief execs of environment and development organisations who meet regularly, because we know that all of these multiple issues there. And at that time, when we were doing polling, climate and the environment would come anything from 15th to 20th in people's lists of well below health, the economy, immigration, and many other issues. And as many people have seen in the UK recently, the latest Ipsos Mori polling showed that the environment, climate, and pollution was set only behind COVID. And I think that's really important. I think one of the noticeable things about that poll is how it jumped significantly around the time of the recent IPCC report. Because a decade or 2 decades ago, when those sorts of reports came out, the work that we were doing was to try to convince people the correct, to try to overcome some of the denial that came from industries like the fossil fuel industries and others. Whereas today, when that polling comes out, people, I think, really understand that it reflects on impacts on their own lives, on future generations, and recognize the need for global. And why is that critical? Well, that's critical because we know that, as Amira says, climate is an issue that's going to affect one, and that we need such urgent action on that we can't wait until there's a different political party in power, until the public mood has changed. That has to happen now. Whatever colour of party is in government, we need change to continue. With governments placing such a heavy emphasis on polling now, it is critical that they see that this is an issue that the government takes really seriously. And the Climate Coalition, who I work with, used to be called Stop Climate Chaos and became the Climate Coalition in recognition that we needed to reach these different audiences. At the time, we called them small c conservatives. And now, thanks to the fantastic work of Britain Talks Climate, we understand those audiences much better and have a focus on civic pragmatists, established liberals, loyal nationals, and backbone conservatives. And I think you'll hear much more about that during this webinar. So whilst there might be, people on the justifiable critiques of the action this government has or hasn't taken, I think it is worth reminding ourselves that this Prime Minister put a lot of stock on his government to actually first bring COP26 to the and now for the outcomes of COP26 to be successful. So they recognise that this is something that their public wants and that they want to drive forward in their diplomatic agenda. So for us, the focus on COP26 itself is firstly, obviously, to secure the really critical outcomes that we need to see. Secondly, to use this opportunity to secure some of the domestic progress that's needed. But I think it's really important to remember that COPs can be a real pivot moment for host countries. And I've been to several COPs, and it can often lead to climate sort of culture war box following it, and we need to really make sure that we're going on from this COP with climate continuing to be seen as something that unites everyone. So we're doing a lot of work around the campaign that we're calling the Fight That Unites. Last country, over 200 local green weeks, and a huge number of people who are now looking at how they can get involved during COP26. So I'll leave it there. I'm really sorry that I have to drop off, but hand you back, Dave. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ben. Great scene setting. Really appreciate you coming in. Right, so let's get on with the research. I'm going to hand over to Susie Wang, our senior researcher, who's going to run through the key results. Do put questions in the Q&A box as Susie goes along, and also do note there is subtitling available if you click on, I think it says see subtitles or something like that in your screen. Okay, over to Susie.
Thank you, Dave. Hi, everyone. I hope everyone can see my screen. I'm Susie. I'm going to talk about some of the key results that we found from Britain Talks COP26. I'm going to stick to the top line results, and Robin will come in later to talk about more the interpretation. All right, so before I begin, I'm going to give a really brief recap of the Britain Talks climate segments in case people are not familiar. So in 2020, Climate Outreach, alongside our key partners, More in Common, the European Climate Foundation, and YouGov, produced Britain Talks Climate, which segmented the UK public into 7 groups based on their values and perspectives when it comes to climate change. We found 2 groups that were very ideological, that identified particularly with a political stance or political party, and those were the progressive activists, who are mostly left-wing and the most concerned about climate change, and backbone conservatives, who are mostly right-wing and who still care very strongly about the environment, but are put off by the kind of activism that they see as represented by the progressive activists. The remaining segments have political leanings and values, but are not quite so ideological. So, for instance, the next 2 groups are disengaged. So the disengaged battlers and the disengaged traditionalists. And we've called them that because they have quite low social and political engagement. They're not very involved in community groups. And around 30% of both segments don't vote in elections, in referendums. They also share the feeling of being sort of left behind by society, and both groups tend to be from C2 DE social grades. What distinguishes them are their values. So disengaged battlers actually care, they care quite strongly about climate change. They want to do more, but they see environmentalism as something that is much more of a middle class thing and maybe out of reach for them. And they also tend to be younger and live in more urban areas. The disengaged traditionalists, on the other hand, tend to be older. They're more conservative leaning, more traditional, and they're skeptical of societal sort of progress in terms of sort of social progress, but also in terms of climate change as well. So there's some skepticism among this group, and they're sort of in general the least engaged on climate change. Demographically, the loyal nationals are similar to disengaged traditionalists in that they also tend to be from C2D social grades. They are older and more conservative leaning. A large majority of this group voted to leave, and what distinguishes them is that they are actually very politically active, and they feel sort of threatened by issues such as crime, immigration, and also climate change. So they're the third most concerned about climate change. And the final two groups are engaged with climate change, but not ideological. So on the sort of left-leaning side, we have civic pragmatists who are second most concerned about climate change, but are not politically active. They feel like they really can't do much politically, but their actions are much more on a household level. And established liberals who are sort of socially progressive and fiscally conservative, they would support things like a tech solution, something like that. So that was a really, really brief recap. If you want to read more, I've got a link to the full toolkit on the bottom of the slide there, and you can click on that link when we share the slides. In this particular project, we focused on two key segments. They are the loyal nationals in the blue and the civic pragmatists. And we did this because we identified those two segments as being particularly important for making sure that communications around COP26 is as effective as possible. So civic pragmatists, as I said, are the second most concerned about climate change, but they are politically demotivated. So by reaching them, we broaden the audience for climate change and also for COP26. They also represent a bit more of a moderate voice than the progressive activists and have the potential to unite and other segments and not alienate them. Loyal nationals are included also because they're the third most concerned about climate change, but their view on climate change is more of as a local issue rather than a global issue. And they also have a skepticism of multilateralism and a skepticism of political elites. So we wanted to sort of manage any communications risks by making sure that the messages that we were producing resonated with loyal nationals. So the first stage of this research was focus groups with those two segments, where we tested 6 different kinds of messages about COP26, and we also talked to them about their views, and we refined them and tested across all segments views on a final 4 sets of narratives with what's called a randomized control trial. So I'm going to go into more detail about that now. So we sampled around 4,000 people, and it was a representative sample of Great Britain along the lines of gender, ethnicity, age, and region. I'm going to not pause too long on this because I want to get to the results, but you will be able to see the exact numbers later. So a randomized control trial is a form of message testing. And what we did was we divided the whole sample into 5 different groups, and those 5 groups received different messages or no message at all. And so these are the messages that we tested in the end. There was one message for one group that talked about global cooperation, and this presented COP26 as a chance for world leaders to come together, put aside their differences, and produce a plan of action for climate change that can help everyone. Another group saw a message about green investment, which was a little bit more of a national focus, looking at COP26 as an opportunity to bring about the green industrial revolution and clean and decent and stable jobs in clean industries. Yet another message looked at nature and talked about COP26 as a chance to restore our balance with nature and make sure that the environment is healthy so that it can protect us. And the final message that we tested with a different group was transparency. So this one spoke about how COP26 leaders need to not only say the right words, but also make sure that their actions are consistent with what they're saying. And a final condition showed no messages, but only a definition of COP26, which everyone else also saw. So by splitting this up into different groups, we were able to make sure that any questions that we asked after the messages, we could say that this result has been influenced by a particular message. And we could contrast that with people who didn't see any messages at all. So I hope that's clear enough. Happy to answer questions on this later as well. So this is an example of our results, the way that we presented them in the report, and I'm going to talk through how to read this figure. So across the bottom, we have the different message conditions. We have global cooperation, green investment, nature, and transparency. On the vertical axis is agreement, from 5 being strongly agree to 1 strongly disagree. And what you're seeing in the figure is the average agreement with the statement, this message makes me want to do more to protect the environment in each of the conditions. So the circle represents the average and the lines represent the error around that average. So what you can see from this is that the average is highest in the nature condition, followed by global cooperation, and green investment and transparency are at around the same level. So another way of looking at this is to show you the percentage of people who strongly agreed or somewhat agreed with this message. So click and you should be able to see them now. Basically, 67% of people who read the nature message agreed or strongly agreed that reading that message made them want to protect the environment and do more. And this was quite a bit higher than for global cooperation and higher again for the remaining 2 messages. And in general, our results show that the nature message and the global cooperation messages were the most effective, which I'm going to talk through a little bit more. But this figure shows that we see similar results when it comes to shifting people's views on what the UK government should do when it comes to tackling climate change. So this question was also asked in the control condition, whether they agreed with the statement, the UK government should prioritise tackling climate change. And so when they hadn't read any messages at all, 55% of people tend to agree with that. And when they read any of our test messages, this increased to 62% for a couple of the messages and 69% for the nature condition. So that's quite a bit of an increase after reading our messages. We also looked at how these messages affected how people would prioritize COP26 aims. You can see the aims that we tested along the left here. So from ending deforestation to phasing out new petrol and diesel cars. And the percentages in the first column are percentages that were from the control group. So people hadn't received any messages and they just ranked how high a priority each of these aims were. And the percentages show people who indicated highest or a very high priority. So actually, when you see this 33% figure at the bottom, it's not that people are opposed to the policy, it's just that they don't see it as the highest priority. What we found is that the global cooperation condition was able to increase people's sense that a couple of these aims should be of higher priority, and the nature condition actually increased across all of the COP26 aims. So it had quite a powerful impact on what people thought were the highest priorities. We also found that the messages that we tested affected people's judgments of what they are personally likely to do in terms of their own behaviors. So in this figure, you can see people's judgments of how likely they were to reduce their own meat consumption, which tends to be a more difficult behavior to shift. And in the control condition, we see that 26% of people are very likely or somewhat likely to reduce their meat consumption. And this increased by 10% in the nature condition and almost as much in the global cooperation condition, with I think not quite so significant increases in the remaining 2 conditions. And we see similar results when it comes to voting. So those of you might remember from the Britain Talks climate research that not many segments indicated that they would vote for a political party based on their climate change policy. And you can see in the control condition, that's around 32% of people. But this increased quite a bit, 11% in the nature condition. So after reading the nature message, people indicated that they were more likely to vote based on climate change policy. And you see also an increase in the other conditions as well. We also broke it down by the key segments that we looked at. And you can see in the pink here for the Civic Pragmatists, who, as I mentioned, the second most concerned about climate change. Reading these messages didn't really shift their likelihood of voting either way. But for the Loyal Nationals, which are in the blue, you can see that reading the nature passage actually increased their the number of people who said that they would be likely to vote based on climate change policy by 15%. And this is particularly striking given that the Loyal Nationals is what we, one of the segments that we roughly refer to as a red wall segment. And not only the message, I mean, the message is important, but it's also important who is saying that message. And this sort of came up in our research as well. So we tested, in this case, specific people that we felt people might trust when it comes to talking about climate change. And what you see on the vertical axis is 5 represents that they trust this person completely to talk about climate change, and 1 means that they don't trust this person at all. And unsurprisingly, David Attenborough tops the scale, followed by Chris Packham, and on the other end of the scale we have politicians, which who tend to be untrusted in general. The other thing to note about this is that the people on the end of the scale also were not well known to many of the participants. So quite notably, 68% of people indicated that they didn't know who Alex Sharma was, and 78% didn't know who Antonio Guterres was. So just to finish up, the last question that we asked people was whether they thought that it was acceptable for global leaders to fly to international talks on climate change. So for instance, COP events being one of those. And what we found is that the majority of people indicated that they didn't think it was acceptable because video conferencing technology is available at 47%. And fewer people said yes, either because everyone should be allowed to take flights or because meeting in person is the best way to get things done. When we divide this by segments, and this is grouping across yes and no in general, we find that the majority of segments indicate that it's not acceptable, with the established liberals being sort of split more evenly. And this indicates that there's potentially more work to be done on explaining why these international talks need to be done in person. So that was a very quick overview of the key results. I'm going to leave it there and pass on to Robin now. Thank you.
Yeah, just before we hear from Robin, thanks Susie, just a reminder that the question and answer box is there for your questions. A few going in there already, and you can upvote if you like a question someone else has answered. You can give it a thumbs up and I'll get more attention to it. And Susie, there's a couple of questions got in there already that you might be able to answer in line. Failing that, we'll come back to questions later. So let me hand over to Robin Webster, Senior Programme Lead for Advocacy Communications at Climate Outreach, who's going to talk about the implications of everything Susie has talked about for advocates and campaigners.
Hello everyone, and thanks so much. It's so exciting to see you all on the screen. I'm just going to share the slide. Hope that this works. Perfect. So as Dave and Susie have said, I'm going to be talking a little bit more about the implications of this, of the work that we've done for advocates who are communicating around COP26. And I think both Ben and Amira have already talked much more eloquently about this. So just to say briefly, the sort of question of, well, why are we doing this? In Climate Outreach, we've been thinking about this not just from the perspective, it's incredibly important from the perspective of the moment, in the creating that sense of pressure on the politicians, on the negotiators who are here, going to be here in the UK, doing that negotiating, but also that this is something that is likely to have a longer term implications for engagement with climate change in the UK across different parts of society, and that potential for it really to be a moment of lift up and where people really become much more engaged. But as Ben also mentioned, there are some potential negative implications if culture war or other debates have a major impact. So this is one of the reasons why we think it's really important to be sort of thinking about this right now and to be using this research. As Susie said, and I think it's really fascinating that this messaging around protecting people and nature came through so strongly as something which was really compelling and powerful across the different groups we tested. So we suggest that as a result, language that emphasises the damage done to land and oceans, the importance of restoring humanity's balance with nature, and this concept of balance is something that has also come up across the years as a really compelling idea in Climate Outreach's research. And what we found in the research, in thinking about the focus groups backing up the more online work that Susie was talking about, is that this kind of language really connected on a personal level. We had civic pragmatists and loyal nationals, people saying, when you're talking about nature, this makes me feel a part of something that I care about, that I want to do something about. And we also found that the people in our focus groups talked about climate change very often in the context of extreme weather events. So they talked about floods in the UK, wildfires in Australia, coverage they'd seen about extinctions. And we can see that the people that we have been talking to, that the language of climate crisis is now something that really crosses over different parts of society. People are really open to it, are willing and understand that level of crisis, but are seeing it through this prism of extreme weather events and nature. And this is one quote, but I could have picked out many others from a loyal national talking about this: preventing habitats and protecting species from becoming extinct is the most important and motivating factor for me in leading a sustainable lifestyle. So just what we've done also in testing language is we thought about the kind of language that's compelling, what kind of language might be helpful in people talking about COP26, and particularly the last sentence I've got here. This means ending deforestation, protecting and restoring land and oceans. That's vital to the survival of our planet. If we don't protect nature, it can't protect us. We found that this was some of the most compelling language that resonated with both civic pragmatists and loyal nationals in our research. Secondly, and as Susie has already said, this idea of a shared global crisis and responsibility. And this quote from a civic pragmatist: if it's the world coming together, that's what can make a difference. And that idea of a shared global crisis and responsibility to COP being a moment where we need global cooperation and unity. We need the world to come together in response. And this was a particularly powerful idea for civic pragmatists. And we believe that it confirms the findings from other studies that we've recently been doing, that we can see in the wake of COVID-19, the public have an improved understanding of our interdependence, and that's perhaps leading to a more global mindset. But as I'll talk about a bit later on, I think it also links to the unique nature of COP. This is a moment where people are particularly interested and particularly thinking in this way about global cooperation and unity, and that therefore makes this kind of language particularly powerful. So again, looking at the kind of language that we did in the testing, this is the kind of language that was the most powerful, and we suggest might resonate with people across the political spectrum. And particularly this first sentence was a particularly sort of compelling idea. Climate change doesn't respect borders. We all share the same planet, so we must do all we can to fix climate change. Then I think really interestingly, given a sort of history of using this kind of language in the sort of green movement, the language of green investment and jobs, we found that it was really compelling. It does resonate with people across the political spectrum, including loyal nationals and civic pragmatists. But what we also found that is actually this kind of language where we're talking about green leadership, green jobs, it does perform better in relation to questions about domestic rather than global concerns. And therefore that makes it potentially less powerful in the context of COP26. And this was particularly notable, particularly noticeable with civic pragmatists who hold this strong ethos of cooperation, working together as being something really powerful and important. Civic pragmatists really didn't like the green investment language when they could sort of sense that there's some kind of nationalistic overtone to it, you know, that Britain is going to be taking the lead or going above others, because they didn't see it as fitting with that cooperative ethos of COP. So again, while this language might be compelling in some contexts, we suggest that activists would need to take care with it in the context of COP. And I think also, again, what this points to is kind of the uniqueness of COP as a moment and the language of COP. We also found in another part of the work is that language around fairness, which is the fairness of climate policy, is an incredibly important conversation, one which is really live at the moment. But in this research, it was less powerful because people saw it as somewhat less relevant to the international conversation that they were having. So it's kind of thinking about what's relevant to people in the context of this particular debate. Again, here's an example of language that we tested around the Green Revolution, which was particularly, you know, it did do well. It was compelling language. People did respond to it, particularly this section about moving away from polluting industries having a chance to create a new generation of decent, stable jobs to clean industries like electric cars and renewable energy. But there is that caveat about potentially, if people see it as nationalistic, it can put them off. And if people don't see it in the context of COP, that can also make it less compelling. Some other kind of problems, I guess, potentially that came out of this research. We did encounter a low-level understanding of COP26. In fact, there's in the research we used the word incredulous, that participants were incredulous that they hadn't heard more about it, and they said, well, if this is so important, well, why haven't I heard about it before? The government should be running some kind of national publicity campaign to make me understand more about it. But that initial understanding was really low, and I think this testing was done in August, so therefore, we may well see a change in that as media coverage ramps up. But I do think it's potentially something that communicators need to be really aware of. We also found that there's, when people do start actually talking about COP and getting a greater understanding of it, there's this relationship between trust and cynicism. A lot of cynicism about politicians. They're only focused on money and growth. They don't really care about this. And taking a step back and saying, okay, well, now I understand this is the 26th time people have had this meeting. If this is the 26th time they've had this meeting, is this really a moment that's going to make a difference? So as people gain a greater understanding, there's quite a significant potential for them to be quite cynical about what will be the outcomes and potential for COP. Questioning the value of meeting in person. This research was done in August, and as Susie highlighted, looking at the value of should this be done online rather than be done in person. Nearly half of respondents saying talks should be done online, and only a quarter seeing that value of it in person. So it clearly there's something quite live there that could well have an impact on how COP is discussed in this context. Just to quickly finish off thinking about the particular audiences, so civic pragmatists and loyal nationals. So as Susie said in a very brief overview, civic pragmatists being the sort of a more moderate audience who are less political but are engaged and concerned about climate change, and loyal nationals being an audience that is highly concerned about climate change but also has more right-leaning views, more populist views, and tends to feel quite threatened. So one of the reasons, as Susie said, we looked across these two different segments as it's kind of a way of getting a good proxy for thinking about arguments that might resonate across different parts of society. What we found is that civic pragmatist narratives centered around global cooperation were really powerful with civic pragmatists. So the idea of stronger working together, and also they had quite a strong sense of the need to protect vulnerable countries. Civic pragmatists were more open to understanding the kind of idea of a global set of policies and thinking about the kind of details of that. But they did find nationalistic language more off-putting, as I talked about before. And also, as civic pragmatists gained a greater understanding of COP in the focus groups, they expressed the desire to be more personally involved in it. Said, okay, so I support the aims of this. Now I understand it. What can I do about it? Can I be a part of it? So thinking about some of the language that we tested, as I talked about before, the need to think about climate cooperation focused language, climate change doesn't respect borders, talking about sharing the same planet, the nature-based language, talking about ending deforestation, protecting lands and oceans, and understanding that if we don't protect nature, it can't protect us. This is all language that we found will be particularly powerful for civic pragmatists. Loyal nationals. So loyal nationals, I think the work around Britain Talks Climate that's been done on loyal nationals is really fascinating and sometimes quite challenging to kind of preconceptions. That we found 60% of loyal nationals say they are extremely or very concerned about climate change. So this is an audience that is open to language about the climate crisis, have high levels of concern about climate change. But they're also an audience that's distrustful of multilateralism, government, and big business, feel quite personally threatened, have strong concerns about transparency and the need to be clear and people to be open with them. They'll probably be very open to language about prioritising, forcing businesses to publicly state their impact. And they're calling for greater, so this is probably an audience who will be interested in calling for greater transparency around COP26. And they're open to, particularly of all the segments, loyal nationals were the most open to language about personal responsibility. So some of the language that again might resonate with this audience, the nature-based language, as we talked about before, which is kind of compelling across the different segments, talking about the need to share the same planet, but also this is an audience that was more open to sort of language about Britain and being Britain at the heart of the Industrial Revolution and taking a lead, more open than Civic Pragmatists to that kind of language. As Susie also said, the right narrative needs the right messenger. And I know this is probably something that you've all heard many times before, so just reiterating it again, that people make decisions based on what others they respect and trust are doing or saying. So it can never just be about the words, it is about who they're saying, who's saying it. I think it's really fascinating that you think that the interaction between the narratives we're talking about and who's actually saying them, people tended to distrust the narratives around green investment if they sort of sounded something like a kind of party political broadcast, something coming from an untrustworthy politician, much more likely to trust narratives around UK leadership if they were from a spokesperson that they trusted, like David Attenborough, rather than the Prime Minister. Perhaps David Attenborough is seen as having kind of less skin in the game in terms of being someone who's actually doing that for their own benefit. But interestingly, these narratives around global cooperation and nature did sort of make sense in the sense of sort of coming from an environmental charity or a group like the United Nations. People saw that as logical. Yes, an environmental charity would be likely to be saying that, so that kind of resonates with me and makes sense to me. So very quickly, in summary, as I come to the end, we found that messaging that speaks to the need to protect nature and frames climate change as a shared global crisis and responsibility, particularly in the context of COP, is likely to resonate. We found that language around green investment and jobs is effective, but as with these caveats, particularly not when it undermines a sense of cooperation, which is particularly fundamental to the moment of COP. And engagement needs to take account of the various dynamics that are going on, a basic lack of knowledge about what COP is, a cynicism, and then the beliefs and the dynamics around whether it should be happening online. Of course, there are other debates about whether it should be happening at all, which may be likely to interact with some of these. So I think that's come to the end of the Q&A. So I will stop sharing.
Thank you so much for that, Robin and Susie and all the presenters. We'll move to question and answers just in a sec. Could we put the slide up again, just as it was? I want to just put one more slide up. Someone present that. Thank you very much. So I just wanted to say before we get to questions, if you wanted to register your interest in a peer learning session with Susie, Robin and other advocates and campaigners from across the sector for a more interactive session to really dig into the implications of this work and how you might use it, drop me an email. It's david.powell@climateoutreach.org. And we propose that we'll do that on the 12th of October at 3 p.m. We'll have loads and loads of interest. Space is going to be pretty limited to make that effective, so we won't be able to fit everyone in, but drop me an email if you would like to register interest for a more in-depth session. And in a second, I'll paste my email into the chat so you have that as well. And also, if you just put the next slide up, please, Siri, we are just going to put a quick poll up while we're fielding questions in a second. Here again are the 7 Britain Talks Climate segments, which Susie and Robin have talked about. This is not going to be a scientific exercise at all, but we'd be fascinated to find out which of these segments you are hoping to reach in your COP26 engagement, if any, and you can pick more than one. It'd be very useful to get a snapshot of such things, and I think we should be able to share the results when the poll closes. We'll leave it there for 5 minutes or so. Okay, over to questions. And the first one I'm going to take, and I'm going to ask this of Robin. Sorry, Robin, I know you've just come off, but it's from Karina. Karina's question is, do you think that any of these messages are transferable to post-COP public engagement, or they're very specific to this context?
Thanks, Karina. That's a really interesting question. I mean, I think the simple answer is absolutely yes. And in some ways, actually, we might be thinking about them in different contexts. I'm very aware in having a conversation like this, that conversations around nature, for example, at COP, will often tend to be situated within a certain set of quite complicated, often quite political debates that might change the nature of that conversation. But I think that it holds quite strongly that this messaging around nature-based messaging did seem to, is really compelling. And I thought it was really interesting, for example, this finding that people talking about climate change in the context of extreme weather events, that is how people are perceiving and conceiving of it. And I think ditto for global cooperation. As I said, obviously, COP is a unique moment in its way, and therefore we have to consider what characteristics are likely to lead people to focus on one issue rather than another. And therefore the kind of, for example, Uber messaging around global cooperation may be more powerful in the context of COP. Messaging around kind of the fairness of specific climate policies might feel less relevant to people, but longer term be something that's actually incredibly important. And I actually think, especially given we have a very live domestic debate on that in the UK, so we might well see that sort of come roaring back. So I think absolutely yes, relevant, something that we can really be thinking about longer term, but with the caveats that, effectively the world around us is changing, and we have to think about how people's engagement with it changes as a result of that.
Fabulous. Nice, succinct answer. Thanks very much. And a question from Good Business. Thank you, Good Business. This is probably for Susie. Why were these 4 messages in particular chosen rather than other messages, for example, about human health?
Thanks very much for the question. Thanks, Dave. Yeah, really good question. So we actually tested 6 different shorter messages in the focus groups that were a little bit more broad, including the ones that we tested in the end, but also one about fairness specifically, and one about future generations. And in past work, we've also tested health messaging. So for instance, there was a report that we released called After the Lockdown that looked at people's responses to communications about climate change in terms of the COVID crisis. And we found that health tends to be an issue that can unite segments in particular ways. But in this research, health didn't emerge spontaneously from the focus groups that we conducted. So we talked about COP26 in focus groups, and that was sort of how we refined and constructed the messages in the end. And similarly, the fairness message was received positively, but it wasn't really one of the stronger messages that resonated with people that we spoke to. And future generations, that message was similar, and people just felt that, I think, what came out in the end is that the narratives with a slightly broader lens and focusing on broader society and nature around that, sort of a global theme rather than individual health or individual jobs or sort of national level jobs were the ones that work the most effectively. And I think also we tried to throw in some words in the messages that tapped into these concepts of health, such as a clean environment or pollution, and they were in the jobs and the nature narrative. So that they were included in there, but they weren't the sort of sole focus. Thanks.
Thanks, Susie. I'm going to combine a couple of questions here, one from James, top of your list there, and also from Stuart, about the nature message, and just asking Susie or Robin, I guess, feel free to jump in, about the nature message. Why did it resonate so much? Was it, just lost it on my screen, was it because it's so simplistic, or because there's something that you think it's tapping into that's deeper than that, about our instinctive sense that we're out of balance with nature? So if there was anything else you wanted to add, Susie or Robin, that you haven't said already about the power of the nature message?
Thanks, Dave. I'm happy to start, and maybe Robin, feel free to come in as well. So we tested the particular line that the world is out of balance also in the COVID research that we did, and that was quite a successful line. I think what we found from this is that perhaps the nature message really resonated because it presented a global view and a global crisis. And it sort of focused on the tangible representations of climate change that people see, that they're seeing the changes in the natural world around them. They're seeing extreme weather events, and they're concerned about those things. And we can see that in their perceptions of what's the highest priority as well. When we look at the COP aims, that things like deforestation and preserving the world's lands and waters was most important to people. I think also, and it's something that we need to look into more, but it also depends on who, when they're reading the messages, who they think it's coming from. And I think in focus groups, people were talking about the nature message as something they could hear as coming from someone like David Attenborough or environmental charities. And having that sort of that tone and that message in mind might have made that message more appealing as well. Anything to add, Robin?
Yeah, come in a couple of things like that, probably slightly more subjective than yours, but I think, a few things on this, and I think a lot of people will be engaging with climate change, as you say, through what they see happening in the world around them, but also what they see being covered in the media. And obviously the framing of the media is often around extreme weather events, so that's probably how people are conceiving and thinking, the sort of automatically where the mind goes to when you think about climate change. We've had quite some interesting debates about this internally, because there's also the question of, do people prefer this language because it's a bit more distancing? Because if you're saying, as international leaders need to protect deforestation, well, that's nothing to do with what I do in my daily life, so it's perhaps a little bit easier as a way to engage with. And I think there's also the final question of, just as we as people, we are people who are surrounded by nature. It's where we come from, and I think that's something. There's all potentially something fundamental as well in our responses to the world around us. So essentially, there's quite a lot going on there.
Fab. Just offer a quick answer if I can. Katja asked a really good question about, these are UK specific findings, but could they, to what extent do we think they could be extrapolated to a global audience? Susie, can you very quickly, just from a methodology point of view, talk to that? And then Amira might have something to say about the global, the extent to which this is a global message.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, good question. So I think from a methodological perspective, the segments that we created are specific to Britain. So we looked at the values that are present among the British population, and we grouped people based on those values. And so it's very tailored to this particular situation. But what's great about this methodology is that we can potentially replicate it in other countries, and based on the cultural context and the cultural values in that place, produce findings that are equally applicable to that location.
Thanks, Amira.
I think it's very important to understand for all of us that context really matters. And so, this research is very much helpful for us for understanding the UK population. And this is also why we try to do research in different contexts, as and when we're invited by civil society and other stakeholders to do work in other contexts. There is research, that shows that some of the messages that have come out here, that particularly around nature, resonate globally. But I think, yeah, at the moment, this piece of work is very much focused on the UK population, and we absolutely do need to sort of work to understand other populations more through sort of doing more direct engagement with them. Thanks.
Fab. Running out of time, so I'm going to ask two questions together. And then maybe if people could also jump in line, panelists, to answer any other ones. So I want to ask Nicole's question about testing other formulation of language around investment that didn't use green, which is a question about the extent to which the word green kind of might prejudice towards some audiences more than others. And then also, while answering, if you could quickly respond to Emily's question, which is, does the nature frame, do we think the nature frame risks abstracting away from human impacts and human causes, and is therefore a less radical proposition? So Susie, any thoughts on either of those? And then maybe over to Robin as well.
Yep, great. Thank you for those questions. I'll start with the green investment one. So that's a good point. So the title that we've used, green investment, is actually, it's a shorthand, but participants didn't see that title. The actual language that we used in the text, I think, only mentioned green once, and that was at the very end of the passage. So we had lines in there like Britain was the heart of the first industrial revolution, and it's a chance to create decent, stable jobs in clean industries. So and also I think better jobs that will help our economy and the environment. So we really tried to steer away from what's sort of more typically, I guess, left-wing language in the testing, and we found that actually the green part of that was not the part that people really that people liked as much. So it's not as the point is that the language that we used tried to embrace a broader way of describing green jobs without using the word green so much. And for the second question, sorry, let me just remind myself what that is. I completely agree. Talking only about nature is definitely sort of we're risking making it too abstract and not connected with humans. And the last 5 to 10 years of research on climate change communications has been about, especially at Climate Outreach, has been about linking climate change to individuals and to their lives and to things that are relevant and that people care about. That's why I think in our message, we tried to anchor that quite closely to people, that protecting nature meant that nature could also protect us, and emphasize that reciprocal relationship and the balance that exists between humans and nature. Thanks.
Thanks, Susie. And Amira, just I think you got anything to add to that last point?
Yeah, just a quick follow up on that, which is that it's absolutely critical that we don't miss the point that, you know, humans, particularly Indigenous communities and marginalized groups, are the custodians of nature. Historically, they have absolutely saved us in a lot of ways. So we can't do nature messaging which kind of detracts from that, but we can do messaging which reinforces their central role in preserving the planet and protecting us from the climate crisis, and therefore that sort of brings them back to the center where they've actually been historically excluded. Thanks.
Wonderful. I'm so sorry, but we are out of time. What I will say is, if you've asked a question in the chat and we haven't answered it, do stick about for 10 minutes or so, and panelists will try to write a response to you, so at least we've covered it off. Sorry we didn't get to everything. Interesting to see the poll results coming up. I hope you can all see that, which showed that it's a win for Civic Pragmatists in terms of audiences, and quite interesting that every audience is being reached by, you know, a non-insignificant amount of people. That's quite an interesting finding, and thank you very much for taking part in that. We should reflect on what that means. Thank you so much to the speakers. Thank you so much to all of you for coming along and staying till the end. You can find all of the research that we've been discussing today on our website at climateoutreach.org, and a recording of this will be available at climateoutreach.org/climate-engagement-lab. A reminder that as you log out, a survey will pop up. If you have a minute to fill that out, we'd find it so helpful to help us with future sessions. And yeah, do stick about if you've asked a question and not got an answer, and we'll try to type one in the Q&A. Thank you so much to everyone. Thank you to Siri for doing behind the scenes amazingness with the tech, and great to see you all, and hopefully see you all very soon. Thanks very much.